Building regulations and fire safety, procedural guidance. This course has been prepared for designers, developers, occupiers, employers, fire and rescue authorities and building control bodies. It explains the steps involved in approving the fire safety aspects of building work and the interaction between building regulations and other fire safety requirements in England and Wales. Scotland and Northern Ireland have their own legislation. Now, if the procedures described in this presentation are followed, developers and designers will be able to receive all the fire safety information relevant to building regulations and other statutory approvals in time to avoid abortive work. Now, owners and occupiers will also benefit as this process will generate the basis of their fire safety management procedures and risk assessment. If followed, there should be no need for extra building work to be done at the end of a building project before the building can be occupied for its intended purpose. Now, it is intended that all building control bodies and fire safety enforcement authorities should use the consultation process as a model for arrangements they make so that procedures will be similar throughout the whole of England and Wales. Now, first of all, let's start with considering where the building regulations apply. Now, the building regulations apply to building work as defined in Regulation 3 of the building regulations, which I will cover later. However, Section 4 of the Building Act 1984 provides exemptions for some establishments that are purely for educational grounds, and you also have Crown premises are also exempt as well. Now, the fire safety requirements of building regulations are given in Part B. So Part B covers fire safety. This is of Schedule 1 to the building regulations. And this covers means of escape, fire alarms, fire spread. You've got access and facilities for the fire and rescue services. Now, how do you demonstrate compliance with Part B of the building regulations? Well, you've got three choices. Approved Document B is one method. You've got BS-9999, which is fire safety in the design, management and use of buildings, which is now the latest fire code out. That's another method. Or you can employ a fire engineer to demonstrate compliance. So that's your three choices as a designer. You can use Approved Document B, BS-9999 or a fire engineered approach. There's your three choices of demonstrating compliance with the functional requirements of building regulations. Now, the fire safety order. Now, the new fire regulations, which replace the Fire Precautions Workplace Regulations and the Fire Precautions Act 1971, the new fire regulations is the Fire Safety Order 2005. Now, the order relates to general fire precautions. Now, this does not include special measures in connection with any work processes which are designed to prevent or reduce the risk of fire from the use of plant or from machinery or the storage of any dangerous substances. These measures are covered by health and safety at work legislation. Now, the fire safety order applies to basically all buildings, to all non-domestic premises, including the common parts of apartment blocks, for example. However, Article 6 of the order does exclude some premises such as you've got certain mines, vehicles and land forming part of an agricultural or forestry undertaking. So there are some exemptions, but generally the fire safety order applies to all buildings. Now, the issue of parallel application. Now, most building work and certain changes of use involved in buildings that are subject to the building regulations will also be subject to the fire safety order once the work is complete and the building is occupied. So you see, you've got a parallel application. And this emphasises the need for consultation between the applicant and the administrating bodies involved at the early stages. In other words, get both parties involved with the applicant. If the consultation procedures are followed, again, there should be no need for any extra building work to be done after the end of your building project before you can occupy it. Now, this aim can only be achieved where all parties take a methodical joint approach to fire safety while discharging their respective statutory duties and responsibilities. And this is important that, like, for example, the fire service get involved. I did a seminar up north and I did ask the fire brigade. It turns out I've said to the building control body they're not interested in the consultation process. They said, look, we don't mind about the consultation process. When the building's built, we'll come in and enforce the fire safety order. Well, the problem is building control makes sure the building meets the code, for example, base double line. What happens if you've got a massive travel distance based on the perceived risk and the impact of sprinklers, etc.? Well, the building complies with building regulations, it signs it off. The fire brigade come in later on and say, wait a minute, where's your travel distances? We've got 80 metre travel distance. We're not happy with that. You can't have an 80 metre travel distance. Yes, but it meets BS double line. We're not bothered. Do you understand? It causes implications later on. The fire brigade must be involved early on in the process to stop any implications when the building becomes occupied. Now, the division of responsibility. There are two main bodies with whom designers, developers and occupiers of buildings may have dealings with concerning fire safety. And these are the Building Control Body and the Fire Safety Enforcing Authority. Now, building control bodies are responsible for checking on compliance with the requirements of the building regulations. Now, the regulations are concerned with building work and with material changes of use. This may give rise to requirements for building work, and the requirements for fire safety will again apply to most buildings. Now, the Fire Authority is the Fire Safety Enforcing Authority responsible for matters relating to fire safety of people in relation to the operation and use of certain buildings once the building becomes occupied. Now, building work that complies with the building regulations requirements for fire safety will normally be satisfactory when it's occupied. So in other words, if it meets building regulations, it should be satisfactory. However, there may be risks associated with the specific operations of the occupier that would not be covered by building regulations. So you need to identify that in the early stages. There is obvious practical value in taking these other fire safety measures into account in the design and construction phases, although the legislation only applies or only becomes applicable on occupation of the building. During the design and construction phase of a project, the building control will check compliance with building regulations. Now, in order to facilitate the consultation process, they should take a coordinating role with fire safety enforcing officers and, where appropriate, with other regulatory bodies. Now, any recommendations and advice given should be channeled through the building control to the occupant. So the building control are the lead body. Now, once a building is occupied and in use, then the Fire Safety Enforcing Authority take on the coordinating role. So now they become the lead authority. Now, licensing and registration authorities should ensure that the Fire Safety Authority is consulted about premises that need to be licensed. So if a building needs a license or it needs registering, they must make sure that they contact the Fire Authority. That's the ruling. Building regulation and compliance. It is the responsibility of anyone carrying out building work to comply with the relevant requirements of building regulations. Now, there's the various approved documents that show how to comply with this, and as I said, approved document B is to comply with Part B. The design and construction of building work is subject to checks by a building control body. Now, the applicants can decide whether to apply to the local authority for building control or to appoint an approved inspector. Now, the two types systems of building controls are detailed in the manual to the building regulations. So you can apply to the manual to the building regulations to go through the different enforcing authorities. Now, where the applicant applies to use or decides to use the local authority, there will generally be a choice of two routes. You've got two routes. You've got the full plans procedure or the building notice option. So there's two options. Now, full plans application. A full plans application involves seeking formal approval of plans. An approval or rejection must be given within a 5-week time limit or 2 months if the applicant does agree on this. And there is a facility to request a determination of disagreements from the first Secretary of State. So in other words, if there's a disagreement here, you can go through the determination process. Now, when a full plans application is made, the applicant can ask the local authority for a completion certificate when the work is complete. In other words, now it's done, I want a completion certificate. However, the other route, the building notice route, a building notice, however, is simply given to the local authority at least 2 clear days before work begins. There is no associated right of appeal other than to a magistrate's court against any requirement the local authority may make should they decide that there is a contravention when they inspect the work. Now, where the building is to be put to a relevant use, in other words, where the fire safety order applies, or after completion it applies, the building notice procedure cannot be used. So if that building comes under the fire safety order, you can't use the building notice procedure, you must use full plans procedure. What about approved inspectors? Now, if an approved inspector is engaged, the person intending to carry out the work and the inspector must jointly give to the local authority an initial notice. So they give them an initial notice. Now, the local authority has 5 days in which to accept or reject this notice. And if the local authority have neither accepted or rejected the notice by the end of that 5 days, the notice is deemed to be accepted. So if they don't reply, it's accepted. Once the notice has been accepted, the approved inspector is now responsible for supervising the work. Now, if the applicant wishes to have detailed plans of the work certified as complying with building regulations, and the approved inspector is satisfied with the plans, a plan certificate will be issued to the applicant and the local authority by the approved inspector. Now, when the work is complete, when it's finished, the approved inspector must give the local authority a final certificate unless they disagree, and in these cases there is a facility to request a determination of disagreements from the Secretary of State. So the same process for approved inspectors if there is a disagreement. Now, what about liaison between different building control bodies then? It's not uncommon for different building control bodies to deal with different parts or different stages of a single development. For example, the construction and then the fit out of a shopping centre. Now, in such circumstances, it's important that building control bodies are made aware of any fire protection arrangements or the fire safety strategy which are outside the scope of their responsibility, but which could have an impact on the works that they are dealing with. So it might be out their responsibility, but they should still be made aware of any special fire protection arrangements or strategies. And responsibility for ensuring there is adequate liaison between the different building control bodies lies with the applicant. So the applicant is responsible for making sure the different building control bodies are communicating. Now, what about fire risk assessment and the fire safety order? Then how does this all come into it? Now, by virtue of the fire safety order, the responsible person who will take over the building, responsible person, is required to carry out a fire risk assessment of the premises. And this must be suitable and sufficient, and it must be a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks to which relevant persons, so that's visitors and employees, or anybody resorting to the premises, are exposed for the purpose of identifying the general fire precautions they need to take to comply with the requirements under the fire safety order. Now, if there's more than 5 employees, or the premises are subject to a licence or an alterations notice, which I'll come on to later, then the significant findings of the fire risk assessment must be recorded. So there's the situations where it must be recorded. And to ensure that this information is available on request to the Fire Safety Enforcement Authority. In other words, a fire officer turns up, I want to see the fire risk assessment, you must make it available. Now, although these regulation requirements are applicable to a workplace during building work, whilst in operation it would be useful for the designers of a building to carry out at least a preliminary fire risk assessment as part of the design process. You know they're going to have to do it afterwards. In the preliminary process, carry out a fire risk assessment. It'll really help later on. So the designer should consider fire risk assessment, what strategy is going to be involved in the building beforehand. Now, the level of detail of this assessment will vary depending on the amount of information available to the designer and whether or not the eventual occupier of the building is known at the design stage. So if they don't know the design stage, they can hardly work out it's going to be a phased evacuation, a simultaneous evacuation. They don't know that. So sometimes this information is not available. Now, if a preliminary risk assessment is produced, it can be used as part of your building regulations submission, and it can assist the Fire Safety Enforcing Authority in providing advice at an early stage as to what, if any, additional provisions may be necessary when the building is occupied. For example, if you're reducing the standards somewhere because of good management, they need to know that. So the strategy, any further information on the risk assessment will help the Fire Safety Enforcement Authority accept or not accept the whole strategy. And it will also assist employers and the responsible person when developing a full fire risk assessment, and it will act as a record of the rationale behind the safety design of the finished building. Now, this is particularly important if you're going to apply codes such as BS-line, because in that code, if you have a high ceiling, for example, you can extend the travel distances by, say, 10%. Well, those travel distances are dependent on that ceiling height. Well, this information must be put down, because if not, later on the building manager might come in and say, look at that ceiling height, let's put a false ceiling in. Well, you can't do that. That rationale must be incorporated in the fire safety manual, and it must be incorporated in the risk assessment. So the rationale behind how that building was designed must be included. Another example, for example, is atrium. When they're designing atrium and with the smoke control requirements for atrium, they've got to base it on a fire design. In other words, they'll pick a fire design for that atrium. Now, if your designer uses a 1 megawatt fire in the design because they say, well, there's nothing going to be in there, and the building's built occupied, then the manager comes along and says, I know what I'll do, we'll put loads of stuff in there. We'll build a coffee shop in the middle. Well, you can't do that, because that atrium and that smoke control is designed for a 1 megawatt fire. You're putting in a much bigger fire. So it's very important you get the rationale. It is fundamental to the principle of the fire safety order that fire precautions will usually need to change and evolve with the building throughout its life. Now, fire risk assessments should be dynamic and kept constantly under review to make sure that precautions are adequate and effective. Now, let's go through the consultation process. When a building is likely to be used for a purpose that is subject to both the fire safety requirements or other legislation, consultation between the relevant bodies is an essential part of the building control procedure. Now, whilst there are clear distinctions of jurisdiction between building work and an occupied building, it's often impossible when considering the overall level of safety in a building to separate physical fire safety measures and the way in which the building will be managed. So it's quite difficult to do this. And obviously this course will go through the statutory consultations that fire safety enforcing authorities and building control bodies are obliged to carry out. So what I'm going to go through is what they're obliged to carry out. And it also indicates where discussions may be needed to consider fire safety proposals at an earlier stage than those required for statutory consultation, so as to keep all parties informed and avoid any delays. Now, these discussions may be between the applicant and the building control body only, or they may involve the fire enforcing authority. Where a building control body is formally engaged in checking the compliance of building work with the building regulations, and again the building comes under the fire safety order, statutory requirements to consult the fire safety enforcement authority at certain stages of the process, mandatory consultation. And these consultations are necessary so again the Fire Safety Enforcement Authority are aware of the erection or alteration of buildings in which they may have a direct or indirect interest or responsibility. And they also may provide an opportunity to make the applicant aware of any action that may have to be taken on non-building regulation matters in order to satisfy the fire regulations afterwards. In other words, that building manager might know, well, once this building is occupied, the fire brigade are going to require this and this. And if the building controller put any relaxations in, the fire brigade may say, we are going to challenge this when this building is occupied. That's what can happen. They can do that. You don't want that issue. Get involved in the consultation process. Now, fire safety enforcement authorities and building control bodies will often hold useful information relating to the design of existing buildings. And the consultation process provides an opportunity to share this information with the other parties. Yeah, the fire brigade may have plans and the building control may have plans of any existing buildings, so they can share this information. There may be occasions where more than one building control body is dealing with different building work with the same building as well. And in these circumstances, it's advisable for them to consult with each other as necessary to avoid any conflict that might otherwise arise. In other words, if there's two building controls work on the same building, consult with each other. Now, consultation with all relevant parties can also help to achieve consensus where alternative technical solutions may be available, such as during the specification of fire detection and alarm systems. You know, it might say in the code the minimum standards in L2. They might go for an L3, an L4, an L5, and then you've got to have arguments about, is that adequate? And again, you want the Fire Enforcement Authority as well as building control to accept the level of detection in that building. And if they're using that as a trade-off, they want to accept that while the building's being built. Because once the building's gone up, then the Fire Authority can say, we don't accept that. You don't want, again, this issue. As an example, a fire risk assessment agreed by the relevant parties may assist in determining the fitness for purpose of alternative means of providing a fire alarm. For example, a shouted warning or a simple electrical alarm or a fault-monitored electrical alarm, so different levels of alarm. Now, effective decisions made at the specification stages can save considerable rectification costs if corrective action proves necessary after completion of the building work. In other words, it's cheaper to do it to start with than it is to rectify it later. Now, the Fire Safety Enforcing Authority must also consult with the local authority and, where an initial notice is in force, the relevant approved inspector before issuing an enforcement notice under the fire safety order. So under the fire safety order, the fire brigade can issue enforcement notices. They must inform the local authorities. Now, consultation with other legislation or other acts. Now, there are provisions in other primary legislation and in some places in local acts which require consultation to take place between local authorities and fire authorities. So yeah, it's not just the standard consultation process, local acts will also require this consultation. Premises subject to licensing or registration. Now, many premises are controlled through a licensing procedure in which fire safety matters are of important concern. For example, safety at sports ground and places of entertainment. Now, where you need these, you must consult with a fire authority as well. So they must consult with the fire authority and get their general advice prior to the fire brigade coming in when they take the lead role.